Hello and welcome to On the Banks. In this programme we'll be taking a look at the Leaf Fields. We'll be visiting Inniscarra Dam, on to Ballincollig and finally to Bishopstown. We begin our journey here in the Leaf Fields, which has been a popular recreation ground for thousands of Corkonians down through the years. It is just like the marina on the banks of the Lee, and it is overlooked by the beautiful 19th century buildings of the Waterworks and Our Lady's Hospital. The Fields, a former monastic property, was owned by the Boyles, Earls of Cork. In the early years of the 18th century, the land passed to the ducal Devonshires through marriage, and in 1835 they were auctioned off. In 1932, the Leaf Fields was the site for the Irish Industrial and Agricultural Exhibition, and the following year the site, containing 83.5 acres, was presented to the corporation as a pleasure ground by an anonymous donor. In recent years the corporation has greatly improved Leaf Fields with the planting of trees and shrubs along the river's walkway, which has been linked up with the Bishopstown area via the Carragrawn Wood. Situated also here is the Lee Open-Air Baths, or should I say what is left of them. Built in 1934, it became the city's most favourite haunt for Corkonians, young and old, during the summer months, until it closed some years ago. Today it is being used for storing corporation huts. The city end of the Leaf Fields has become the site for visiting circuses, and of course the Lark by the Lee rock concert, held there every year. The Leaf Fields is as popular for today's Corkonians as it was for our own parents and their parents before them. Running parallel to the Leaf Fields, under the shadow of the County Hall, which was built in 1968, is the Carragrawn Straight Road. 60 years ago, a regular sight here was the Muskerry train. With a carriage heavily laden with goods and passengers, the sturdy train puffed its way out of the Muskerry railway station, which is now the site of Jury's Hotel, along the Western Road, the Carragrawn Straight Road and onto the Muskerry region. In December of 1934, the old train puffed its way into the archives of the past. Well-known Cork journalist and historian Walter McGrath tells us that a walk to Inchigagan Bridge, which is more normally known as the Carragrawn Bridge, will evoke memories of the road races that used to be held around here, the sharp bends at the western end of the Carragrawn Strait in the post-war years. Riders came from all over the world to participate in these races, among them a certain Prince Bira, who was of Eastern origin. Until the mid-50s, the Munster Motorcycle and Car Club also ran its Munster 100 motorcycle races over the same circuit. But continuing development of the area finally meant that it was no longer possible to close the roads for this event, and it had to be abandoned. The country's first hydroelectric scheme was set up on the Shannon in 1927. The second was on the Liffey, and during the 50s 3 more appeared, one of these on the banks of the Lee at Inniscarra. It was constructed to cater for the increasing demand for electricity in the city and county for domestic and industrial use. To tell us more about the station is Jack O'Keefe. Jack, can you tell me something about the dam? When was it built?
The Lee scheme was developed between 1952 and 57 at a cost of about £4.5 million. It involved the construction of 2 dams. The one here behind me, it's a buttress dam, which is 250 metres long by 42 metres high. And the one at Carrigadrohert, which is 12 miles upriver, is 130 metres long by 22 metres high. And between them, they create 2 lakes of a total area of 3,500 acres. And the total storage capacity in them is 45 million tonnes of water. The capacity of the generation capacity of the 2 power stations is 27 megawatts, and in the construction there was 3 road bridges and 12 miles of roadway constructed as well.
Why was this particular point in the valley picked, Jack?
In any hydro scheme, the main determinants of what power you can get out of a system is the head of water and the flow of water. And what you are looking for in a development like this would be a steep-sided valley with a narrow gorge at some point on it, where you can create a lake behind the dam and create a head of water, which would be between the water in the lake and the tail race here at the bottom. The head there determines how much power you can get out of it. And at the point of the dam here behind me, there's quite a narrow gorge in good quality rock, and that have been the determining factor.
What about technology, Jack? Has it moved very much with the times? Is it up to date?
Yeah, over the last 7 to 8 years, the ESB has reviewed the standards of design and technology in all its dams, and all ESB dams, including the two on the Lee scheme, have been brought up to the highest international standards. The main works that were involved in the Lee dams were the positioning of the rock here across the water as a breakwater, and the main item that was done on Lee dams was an additional spillway at Carrigadruhad to take account of the biggest type of flood that we would expect. We refer to it as a 10,000-year flood, but in layman's terms that would be approximately 8 inches of rain in less than 2 days, which would be the biggest that could be envisaged in this part of the world.
How does the dam affect the flooding situation downriver?
Flooding has always and will continue to be inevitable downriver, but the effects of flooding has been lessened by the presence of the dam, insofar as we have a certain amount of capacity, storage capacity, in the normal course of events, and since the dam was built, less than the peak inflow has always been discharged, and that would continue to be the situation. And it's only in the most severe floods that you would have to discharge the full inflow of natural inflow.
To where I can cross over, close to home I cannot say, close to home feeling so far away. Searching never right, I am lost in oceans of light, forever hoping I can find memories.
The town of Ballincollig was founded in the 13th century by an Anglo-Norman family called Barrett, who came and built a castle on a limestone rock, and around that grew a small farming community. The name Ballincollig is traditionally known as Balla an Quillig, or the town of the boar, but more recent opinion favours Collstown, and that derives its name from Robert Coll, who was a 15th century knight who owned a large area of land in this vicinity. The first major development in the history of Ballincollig occurred in 1794, while Charles Henry Leslie, who was a Cork banker, established a gunpowder mill on the southern shores of the River Lee. 11 years later, when Napoleon's control over France was proving a threat to Britain, the British Ordnance Department decided that they would buy the mill from Leslie, and so they established one of the few royal gunpowder mills in the British Empire, the remains of which can be seen behind me. The mill's complex, as we would call it nowadays, comprised of 130 acres, and they were scattered along the main canal and mill races, which stretched for about 1.5 miles along the river bank. The function of the mills was granulating and drying gunpowder, manufacturing charcoal, refining sulphur and saltpetre, and making casks and hooped barrels for the storage of the gunpowder. The canals were constructed for carrying the gunpowder by horse-drawn barges to the magazines. This was deemed the safest way. The mill continued to be worked for government purposes until it was sold to a Liverpool company, Tobin and Horsfall, in 1834, and subsequently took the style of the Ballincollig Royal Powder Works Limited. So prosperous did the venture become that by 1837 200 people were employed in the mill and 16,000 barrels of gunpowder were produced annually. The workers were housed in neat little cottages some distance from the mills, and they were known as the Long and Short Range. Some of them had been converted into beautiful homes. By the middle of the 1850s, the mill had become one of the largest industrial establishments in the Cork area, employing 500 men and boys. By the 1880s, however, the demand for black gunpowder declined as other explosives were invented, and this saw a huge reduction in the workforce. At this time, the mill was bought by Briscoe's, and in 1898, with the amalgamation of a number of British explosive firms, the mill came under the control of Curtis and Harvey. By the dawn of the present century, a number of gunpowder mills had closed down in Britain, and Ballincollig suffered a similar fate in June 1903. During its 200 years in operation, the mill had only 16 serious explosions, 9 of which included loss of life. Today, the canals and the mills, one of which you can see working behind me, are being restored to their former glory. And the Ballincollig Royal Gunpowder Mills is proving to be a major tourist attraction in the area. When the gunpowder mills was established, a security guard used to be dispatched from Collins Barracks in Cork. But in 1806 a decision was taken to build a military barracks here. This was completed in 1810, and the imposing walls, which run the entire length of the town of Ballincollig, are a distinguishing landmark right up to today. During the 19th century, the barrack housed several hundred officers and men, mostly regiments from the Royal Artillery, and their presence spelled prosperity for the garrison town. With the outbreak of the Great War in 1914, there were 6,000 British troops living under canvas in the town. And during the War of Independence, reinforcements for the British regulars and the Black and Tans were stationed there. In 1922, the British vacated the barracks after more than a century of occupation. And after the evacuation, it was taken over by Republican forces, who in turn evacuated it and set fire to their principal buildings in the advance of the Free State troops in 1923. For the next 17 years, Ballincollig Barracks lay derelict. In 1940, at the start of the emergency in this country, it was taken over by units of the Irish Army, and work was started on the rebuilding of the main units. Commandant Mick Hartnett has a particular interest in the history of Ballincollig. Commandant, can you tell me when you first came to Ballincollig?
Yeah, I came to Ballincollig on being commissioned as an officer into the regular army. I was posted here on the 1st of August 1962. I'm from Cork, and I came to Ballincollig, which at that time was a small, sleepy little village of about 400 souls, and it was a very quiet place. It was also a quiet barracks. The big action at the time was troops going and coming from the Congo, which led to a whole new way of life for the army, which since has become a commitment to United Nations that's worldwide. But at that time it was a very small little barracks and a small staff here as well.
What part does the barracks play in the life of the town today?
In fact, it plays a lesser part in the life of the town today than it did then, because there is now somewhere in the region of 17,000 people in the village, and the percentage that the barracks would hold of that number is obviously much smaller. Still, it's a garrison town, Ballincollig is, and the character of it is that of a garrison town. And the long grey wall, whereas it's uninspiring to a lot of people, that is the character of the village. So we are part of the character of Ballincollig.
There's a lot of history attached to the barracks. Can you tell me something about that?
Yes. Originally there was no such place as Ballincollig, and at the turn of the 18th to the 19th century, the gunpowder mills was established on the north side, or the south side of the River Lee, behind us here. And because of the political situation in Ireland at the time, it was imperative that it be guarded, and troops used to come out from what we now call Collins Barracks, Cork, to guard it. And it was deemed prudent at the time to establish a base here. So the lands here, comprising approximately a mile in length along the south side of the River Lee, were taken over by the British War Department and converted into a large barracks. I mean large. There was 400 or 500 troops here, approximately the same number of horses. It was a separate industry in itself. I mean, if you can imagine an industrial revolution taking place in the country, that this is what Ballincollig was at that time. 500 people working in the powder mills below, and more or less the same number of people here in the barracks. It must have been a very interesting and vibrant place to live in at that time. That remained extant up to the turn of this century, and with the War of Independence and the subsequent Civil War, the barracks was lost, and it remained as an open derelict area until 1941, when this room that we're in here now was a billet for the officers of the 31st Battalion, and they moved from here on to Nadbog. And from that day onwards, this barracks had been re-established by the Army Corps of Engineers, rebuilt, and it is what you see it today.
It is now called Murphy Barracks. How did that come about?
That's an interesting one, really, because initially it was known as the Artillery Barracks up to 1866. From 1866 up to 1921, it was known as the Cavalry Barracks. And when it was reopened in 1941, it was known as the Military Outpost Ballincollig. And in 1959, it was decided that all these military outposts, etc., around the country should be given names. And they looked for what name could be given to this place. And the local hero was a man by the name of Walter Leo Murphy, who was the commandant of the local IRA, and was a thorn in the side of the British occupying forces at the time, insofar as he dynamited bridges and made their life here hell. He was killed in Waterfall, and he was the one that was named, used to name the barracks, Walter Leo Murphy. But
a more interesting name before that, hadn't it?
Yes, but, even though it was Murphy Barracks, also in and around 1959, there was a rush to get the use of Irish. And everywhere in this barracks here, all the signs, Stod, etc., were up, long before they were up out on the civilian street. And the big thing here was to keep gates closed because of cattle that were allowed. People were allowed to lease lands and keep the cattle here. Excuse me. So Dún an Gata was put up everywhere, closed the gate. But the name of the barracks that time was Dún í Waracú. So everyone in Cork and nationwide knew the place as Dún an Gata, the gate of the fort, or the fort gate, or whatever. But it's still just Murphy Barracks today.
Today, Ballincollig has become one of Cork's most progressive and fastest developing satellite towns. With a population of over 14,000, by the turn of the century, it will definitely be one of the largest rural towns in the country. Compare that to the year 1659, when the community was made up of 8 people. In recent times, Ballincollig has its own enterprise board, and I spoke with Anne Donaldson, who's their secretary. And when was the Ballincollig Enterprise Board formed, and why?
Well, Ballincollig Enterprise Board came together about June 1990. They were a group of professional people and generally people with a certain amount of expertise. They came together, and the reason was they could see that Ballincollig, which had once been a very small village of about 400 people, had suddenly swarmed forward and become a satellite town with a present population of in or about 14,000. A bit difficult to put precise figures on it for various reasons. And they could see that if somebody didn't take a little bit of interest in the place, that it would just develop at random and maybe become not such a good place to live. So they literally came together and looked at it from that point of view.
What kind of activities and projects have the board been involved in so far?
Well, the board, our big main aim is to generally raise awareness around the country of Ballincollig and of its importance. People don't always know where Ballincollig is or what it is, so we're telling everybody it's a good, fine town, plenty of good shopping, big shops, 2 big supermarkets, plenty of boutiques and very good shoe shops. In fact, anything you want you can get in Ballincollig. There's also quite a lot of small industry in the area and service industries, and our big aim is just generally to promote that and make sure everyone knows about that.
Well, probably the biggest one that people would have known about in recent times is the gunpowder mills here.
Well, yes. Now everybody knows about the Royal Gunpowder Mills, I hope, at this stage. It's a huge, big 400-acre site on the banks of the River Lee. It's absolutely beautiful, and there's a new interpretive centre which really helps to make all those ruins come to life, and we now know what they were about. We're not just wondering anymore.
What about the future plans of the board?
Well, I don't think it will develop house-wise too much more, because well, maybe it will. It's not really planned to do that. Certainly getting tidy towns off the ground is a big plus that's needed. The last 2 years they've been very effective, and in fact they got higher marks this year than they did last, and certainly to tidy up the place. Also, if we could get industry into the town, it's the big cry I know all over the place, but we have a very big population of young people. We have 2 secondary schools and a lot of people at university and regional tech, and all very highly trained, and we'd like to see some of them coming back and being able to settle in their hometown and really make it the final step in making it a community.
The name Bishopstown can be traced back to the 16th century. It was called Ballinaspig Moor and was once part of the medieval manor lands of St Finbarr's Cathedral. It was here in 1726 that the Protestant Bishop of Cork, Peter Brown, built his country residence. Set in a 118-acre estate, it was called Bishopstown House, and also erected here was a chapel and offices for church needs. In the 1870s, the estate left church hands when it was bought by John Magner. By this time, the house had been demolished, along with the office buildings, and the chapel was being used for farming needs. The estate was to change hands many times, and the last owners were the Murphy family, and they sold it to the Cork Corporation in 1973. Well, that's it from On the Banks this time. Do hope you'll join me again next time. Until then, bye-bye.